feeling it, that our participation in some of the things that we do is a way of drawing the children into participating as well. So. Our scripture lesson today is taken from Luke chapter 15, and we are beginning at verse 11. It won't take long before you recognize that this is the parable of the prodigal son. And he, this is Jesus, said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his money in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found.' And they began to celebrate. Now the older son was in the field, and as he came near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, 'Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him.' And he said to him, 'Son, you're always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found.'" Today's message is entitled All is Grace, and that's a title that I borrowed, ripped off completely, from Brennan Manning, who was an alcoholic priest who wrote 2 important books, The Ragamuffin Gospel and All is Grace, in addition to others. Mr. Manning died several years ago now, but he wrote extremely honest books, talking about his struggle with alcoholism while trying to serve God. And these books have been an inspiration to many. In our Sunday school class this morning, we were talking about how people sometimes do all the right things, but their heart was far from God. Brennan Manning was someone whose heart was near to God, but he was struggling with his behavior. And so he wrote from that perspective. Grace is a subject that we hear about in church all the time. Many churches have the word as part of their name, and rightly so. In Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace, he refers to grace as the last best word. While the meaning of so many theological words in our language has been changed, lost, or diminished, grace and all the words derived from the same root still carry some fragrance of the meaning of the word. Consider this. We say grace before meals. Okay? And we're not really just going grace, 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 but it's a prayer of thanks. It's a grace before meals. We are grateful. That comes from the same root. We are gratified. Same root. How about this one? Congratulations. that comes from the same root as grace. When you say congratulations to someone, you are wishing them grace, in a sense, for what they've done. Gracious. I love to describe someone as so gracious. That gives me a picture of what that person is, who that person is. How about this one? Gratuity. That comes from the same word as grace, the same root. Grace notes. Grace notes is in music. If you're a musician, you start to think grace notes are literally a note to give you grace when you mess up. But a grace note is something that's kind of added on, and it may have started as, whoops, I was supposed to play a G and I just played an A. So, and it's a grace note. Okay? Gratuitous. Not earned, not needed. In England, they call duchesses and dukes and things your
grace.
Your grace. Okay? We may receive grace, and that can be exemption from academic requirements. You can be given grace. The act of grace is another word for pardon. Gracing, grace issues, sometimes a magazine. If your subscription is up, they'll give you 2 or 3 more issues. Those are grace issues. You haven't paid for those, and you're given grace issues. Gratis, that means free, right? Something is gratis, but that comes from the same root. And then there's some opposites to grace. Fall from grace. Nobody likes that one. An ingrate, someone who is not thankful. A disgrace, or someone who is in disgrace. That's a terrible thing, to be out of grace, basically. No saving grace. There's no saving grace here. Alternatively, sometimes you'll say, well, the only saving grace they had is this. Right? You've heard that. And then this one, I wouldn't have caught this. Persona non grata. Okay? A person without grace. So like if you're tossed out of the United States and you're not allowed to come back in, you are a persona non grata. Okay? So the grace and the words that come from it are all around us all the time. And many of them are very positive words that we enjoy. And it's kind of nice to know that this word that is a theological word still is so fragrant to us today. We still like it. A lot of other theological words, if you say them, they've got bad connotations now. Not grace. Not grace. All of these words have an attraction for us because of our intense need for grace. And the Bible certainly teaches about grace. And we in the church certainly say that we believe in grace, right? But somehow we have a hard time letting it reside in our hearts. Counselor and author David Seaman said this. Many years ago, I was driven to the conclusion that the major causes of most emotional problems among evangelical Christians are these. Okay, so he's talking about the emotional problems amongst evangelical Christians. He says, here's the major causes. The failure to understand, receive, and live out God's unconditional grace and forgiveness is one. The failure to give out that unconditional love, forgiveness, and grace to other people. We read, we hear, we believe a good theology of grace, but somehow it's not how we live. The good news of the gospel of grace has not penetrated to the level of our emotions, is what he said. There's a wonderful story told about a pastor, and if you've been around me, and you all have for a long time, you've heard this, who began to preach on the prodigal son. And he told the story just like I read it, but with some important changes. In his version, when the son returned, the father sent him away in disgrace and gave a party for the older son who had never left. This pastor was doing this to make a point. But a lady in the back of the church was so overcome that she shouted out, "That's the way it should have happened!" The older son should have got the party. The younger son, the wastrel, should have been sent away in disgrace. And in that moment, that dear sister revealed her heart. But you know what? She revealed a lot of our hearts, too. And this is the problem. Our human nature has a tremendously difficult time with our need for grace. Randy Stonehill sang a song saying, we need the grace of God more than the air we breathe. But while he tries to give it to us, it's not right, but it's poetic, it repels our foolish souls. We don't want to need grace. We're glad when we get it, but we don't want to need it. Let's explore this story of the prodigal son that was read for us a little bit earlier. We have a wealthy Middle Eastern patriarch. He's got 2 sons. He would have been the head of the family, powerful and respected by position. His sons would have owed him their allegiance and their service, but they too would have been respected and had some measure of power by their position. So son number 1 toes the line. He works for his father. He does what's expected in his culture. He does what's appropriate, like the people in our Sunday school lesson this morning who did the right things, but their hearts were far from God. To all intents and purposes, he's a good son. He's a typical firstborn. He's responsible. He's not one to worry about. And then there's son number 2. He's a different kettle of fish altogether. He works for his father, but half-heartedly. Maybe he's a little spoiled being the younger one. I'll tell you, the younger one gets spoiled, I'll just tell you. Mm-hmm. But even while he works, his dreams are shining on distant shores. That's a Barry Manilow song. And the day comes when he thinks he can't take it anymore, and he goes to his dad and he says, hey, I got places to go, people to see. Give me my share of the inheritance I will receive as your son, and let me go. I'm sure it made sense to him. After all, it would all be his one day, and why not get it now and enjoy it while he's young? But he blows off relationship with his father, seeking only the benefits of the relationship. So when do you normally receive an inheritance?
When somebody passes.
When somebody dies. So the younger son basically says to his father, I wish you were dead. That's hard, isn't it? Well, you know the story. The father gives him the money. He goes away and he blows it all in what King James calls riotous living. I always enjoyed that term. Mine says reckless living, but riotous living. His health fails. His friends leave. He's sharing food with the pigs he cares for. That's not ever cool, but especially not if you're Jewish. He comes to himself, which is a great term too. And he says, even the people who work for my father are treated better than this. And he starts the long journey home, practicing his speech to his father all the way. Father, I've sinned. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Would you just give me a job? Okay. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, son number 1 is still there. He still looks good on the outside. Still doing what he's supposed to do. Still working in the fields. Keeping the barn painted. Being a good citizen. Still doing the culturally appropriate thing. But on the inside, things are very different. One of my favorite, Jeremy will remember it, one of my favorite Muppet skits was a Muppet with weird legs saying, on the outside I'm very calm, but inside, and they play the song like a circle without ending, like a wheel within a wheel, and his legs go faster and faster. That's where the older son is. On the outside, he looks great, but on the inside, he's got this whirling resentment going on. Apparently, he's been thinking about his worthless, no-good brother. It seems as if he's building up a good store of resentment towards not just his brother, but towards his dad as well. He may have even lost some respect for the father because of the way he gave in to the son. The father's still there too. He could be worrying about earning back the money his son took. He could be meeting with lawyers to make sure his son's out of the will. He could be writing a bitter tell-all book about his ungrateful child. But he's doing none of these things. Every day he goes out to the mailbox or what passed for one and strains his eyes to look down the road to see if by some chance he sees son number 2 coming back. Son number 1 probably saw this, and that probably added to his irritation. Finally, the day comes that the father's eyes are rewarded with a glimpse of a ragtag, limping, disreputable figure. Could it be? No? Well, maybe. What if? I think it is. And the father lifts up the skirts of his robe and takes off down the road to meet his son. Elderly Middle Eastern patriarchs don't do this, by the way. He flings his arms around the son's neck, cuts off the practiced speech, pulls him in the house, cleans him up, throws a feast, restores a ring of sonship, and reinstates the no-good wastrel. We like this story because it illustrates God's grace, which is so attractive to us. It's a feel-good story about God's love. But there's a jangling note of conflict still to come. Son number 1 comes in from working in the field. He hears the noise of the celebration. When he finds out it's a party for his worthless, no-good, irresponsible brother, he boils over. I've been doing what's right all along. You never gave a party for me. All right, now we know the Christian thing to say, but if we're honest, we get the older son. We get it. We too sometimes feel as if the one who does the right stuff should get the rewards, don't we? The good citizen, the one who does the right things. But that isn't how grace works. And that can make us mad. Truthfully, it really can. The father explains that son number 1 can have a party anytime he wants. All that the father has is his. But a celebration was called for. Son number 2 was dead and is now alive. Grace is not the way the world works. It doesn't make sense. It feels wrong, even scandalous, especially when it's directed towards someone else. When it's directed towards me, I like it well. You know, if Mark offends me and he gets grace, right? I go all older son, okay? We call this story the prodigal son. Prodigal, the word means extravagant, wasteful, imprudent, and son number 2 was certainly that, right? Took all the money, wasted it living, all that. Another meaning of the word prodigal is generous, lavish, liberal, bounteous. This story could also be called the prodigal father, because he certainly was all those things. Son number 1 wasn't really prodigal. There was nothing lavish or extravagant about him. He didn't share the heart of his father at all. There's nothing stingy, pinching, or miserly about God. I'd like to read an updated version of this story for you. Some of you have heard it before, and I'm not even really going to apologize because it's so good for us to hear it. But again, this story is from What's Amazing About Grace by Philip Yancey. A young girl grows up on a cherry orchard just above Traverse City, Michigan. Her parents, a bit old-fashioned, tend to overreact to her nose ring, the music she listens to, and the length of her skirts. They ground her a few times, and she seethes inside. "I hate you," she screams at her father when he knocks on the door of her room after an argument. And that night, she acts on a plan she has mentally rehearsed scores of times, and she runs away. She's visited Detroit only once before on a bus trip with her church youth group to watch the Tigers play. Because newspapers in Traverse City report in lurid detail the gangs, the drugs, and the violence in downtown Detroit, she concludes that that's probably the last place her parents will look for her. California maybe, or Florida, but not Detroit. Her second day there, she meets a man who drives the biggest car she's ever seen. He offers her a ride, buys her lunch, arranges a place for her to stay. He gives her some pills that make her feel better than she's ever felt before. She was right all along, she decides. Her parents were keeping her from all the fun. The good life continues for a month, 2 months, a year. The man with the big car, she calls him boss, teaches her a few things that men like. Since she's underage, men pay a premium for her. She lives in a penthouse and orders room service whenever she wants. Occasionally she thinks about the folks back home, but their lives now seem so boring and provincial that she can hardly believe she grew up there. She has a brief scare when she sees her picture printed on the back of a milk carton with the headline, "Have you seen this child?" But by now she has blonde hair. With all the makeup and body-piercing jewelry she wears, nobody would mistake her for a child. Besides, most of her friends are runaways, and no one squeals in Detroit. After a year, the first sallow signs of illness appear, and it amazes her how fast the boss turns mean. "These days we can't mess around," he growls, and before she knows it, she's out on the street without a penny to her name. She still turns a couple of tricks a night, but they don't pay much, and all of the money goes to support her habit. When winter blows in, she finds herself sleeping on metal grates outside the big department stores. Sleeping is the wrong word. A teenage girl at night in downtown Detroit can never relax her guard. Dark bands circle her eyes. Her cough worsens. One night, as she lies awake, listening for footsteps, all of a sudden, everything about her life looks different. She no longer feels like a woman of the world. She feels like a little girl, lost in a cold and frightening city. She begins to whimper. Her pockets are empty and she's hungry. She needs a fix. She pulls her legs tight underneath her and shivers under the newspapers she has piled on top of her coat. Something jolts a synapse of memory, and a single image fills her mind of May in Traverse City, when a million cherry trees bloom at once, with her golden retriever dashing through the rows and rows of blossomy trees in chase of a tennis ball. "God, why did I leave?" she says to herself, and pain stabs at her heart. "My dog back home eats better than I do." She's sobbing, and she knows in a flash that more than anything else in the world, she wants to go home. 3 straight phone calls, 3 straight connections with the answering machine. She hangs up without leaving a message the first 2 times, but the 3rd time she says, "Dad, Mom, it's me. I was wondering about maybe coming home. I'm catching a bus up your way, and you'll get there about midnight tomorrow. If you're not there, well, I guess I'll just stay on the bus until it hits Canada." It takes about 7 hours for a bus to make all the stops between Detroit and Traverse City, and during that time, she realizes the flaws in her plan. What if her parents are out of town and miss the message? Shouldn't she have waited another day or so she could talk to them? And even if they are home, they probably wrote her off as dead long ago. She should have given them some time to overcome the shock. Her thoughts bounce back and forth between those worries and the speech she's preparing for her father. "Dad, I'm sorry, I know I was wrong. It's not your fault, it's all mine. Dad, can you forgive me?" She says the words over and over and over, her throat tightening even as she rehearses them. She hasn't apologized to anyone in years. The bus has been driving with lights on since Bay City. Tiny snowflakes hit the pavement, rubbed worn by thousands of tires, and the asphalt steams. She's forgotten how dark it gets at night out here. A deer darts across the road and the bus swerves. Every so often, a billboard, a sign posting the mileage to Traverse City. Oh God. When the bus finally rolls into the station, its air brakes hissing in protest, the driver announces in a crackly voice over the microphone, 15 minutes, folks. That's all we have here. 15 minutes to decide her life. She checks herself in a compact mirror, smooths her hair, and licks the lipstick off her teeth. She looks at the tobacco stains on her fingers and wonders if her parents will notice, if they're there. She walks into the terminal not knowing what to expect. Not one of the 1,000 scenes that have played out in her mind prepare her for what she sees. There in the concrete walls and plastic chairs bus terminal in Traverse City, Michigan, stands a group of 40 brothers and sisters and great aunts and uncles and cousins and a grandmother and a great-grandmother. They're all wearing goofy party hats and blowing noisemakers, and taped across the entire wall of the terminal is a computer-generated banner that reads, "Welcome home." Out of the crowd of well-wishers breaks her dad. She stares out through the tears quivering in her eyes like hot mercury and begins the memorized speech. Dad, I'm sorry, I know. He interrupts her. Hush, child. We've got no time for that. No time for apologies. You'll be late for the party. A banquet's waiting for you at home. We love the story. Every time I read it, I do. But truthfully, we'd like to know what happens later. Does the girl stay on the straight and narrow? Does she get clean? Does son number 2, the prodigal, become a good, responsible worker? We tend to be suspicious, aren't we? Well, we step back and we say, well, we'll see. We'll wait and see how this comes out. That's not grace. It's not grace. The Bible doesn't tell us if son number 2 became an upstanding citizen, because it doesn't matter. No one deserves God's grace. Son number 2 doesn't deserve it. Neither does son number 1. Neither does Traverse City Girl. Not you or me either. Not a one of us deserve God's grace. Romans 3:23 says all. Fort Worth ISD, education for all, A-L-L, people. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Romans 6:23 says, the wages of sin, which we all have, is death. But the free gift, gratis, the free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace are you saved through faith. And that isn't of yourselves. It is the gift of God. The faith to believe. Not of works, lest any man should boast. You are saved. I am saved by grace through faith. But it's not because I or you have so much faith that we were able to say, yeah, I believe and I got saved. God gave us the faith to believe. Even that is a grace. We bring nothing to this party except our sinfulness. Those who are new believers are often very aware of their sinfulness and deeply grateful for the grace of God, the grace he's given them. Sometimes when we've been a Christian for many years, and looking around this room, that's most of us, it's easy to get a little bit of elder son syndrome creeping in. Being saved by grace, and hear this, we sometimes think we stand by our good work. Only by grace can we enter. Only by grace can we stand. Okay? We sometimes think we stand by good works, and this is a lie straight from the evil one. It keeps us limited, like son number 1. We can begin to feel resentment, and we lose sight of the heart of our Father. Then we may begin to decide who we should give grace to. How dare we, who have received grace upon grace, withhold it from someone else? We are meant to be channels, conduits of his grace, not, and hear this, not custodians of his grace. We don't curate it and give it to whoever we think should have it. It should flow through us. I remember a time in my life when someone said to me, don't serve God out of guilt. I also remember what I said. But if we didn't serve out of guilt, no one would serve God at all. That's what I thought. I was in the church, I was working for God, but filled with the spirit of the older son. I had no joy, and I didn't understand the heart of my Father at all. It took some pretty sinful rebellion for me to come to an understanding of my sinfulness and the depths and heights of God's grace for me every day. Because, see, I had been a good girl, a good kid. I had never done all the bad things that everybody told us about not doing. all coming up through youth group and all those things. I didn't do any of that stuff. And I didn't really understand that I needed grace just as much as Traverse City Girl or anyone else. As our church seeks to grow, as we seek to grow as individual believers, we must put away any hint of the elder son. We're here by the grace of God. Anyone who God brings to us will be here by the grace of God. When we extend his grace to others, we do it because it overflows from the grace we're receiving in our own lives, not because we have somehow arrived and have our own grace to give. That will never happen. Recently, a fairly new Christian told me that she wasn't important, that she was way more sinful than I was. While I tried to explain that I too am saved through God's grace, it was difficult for her to see. We need to be more honest about our own struggles. When we pretend that we have arrived, it's very hard for people to understand the grace that we want to share with them. To reflect the heart of our Father, we must be lavish in our love, willing to run down the road to meet a wanderer, and open with our own struggles and emotions so the wanderer knows it's safe to come home. There can be no tests, no holding back, no waiting to see if it takes. In the Father's house, there must be welcome, lavish and unstinting celebration. All of us were dead and are now alive. All of us. We were lost and we're now found. It's all because of God's grace. His grace is sufficient for every sin. It's sufficient to save us, to help us stand, to transform us, to show us the Father's heart. And one day we will be completely transformed into the image of Christ by that same grace. The so-called prodigal son actually understood his father's heart far better than the older son. If you're here today thinking that your sin is too great, God would say to you that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on your behalf is infinitely more than enough to take away your sin. Infinitely more. The Father's heart is toward you. He looks each day and will run to meet you. He welcomes you. If you're here today with a little older son syndrome, life hasn't gone the way you think it should. You're a pretty good person. You deserve for things to go well. God would say gently, no, you're a sinner too. And you deserve death apart from my grace. However, my heart is toward you. You don't have to try to stand on your own. You can't anyway. You don't have to strive to earn my love. You have it already. All that I have is yours. I'm going to say it again. God would say to you, all that I have is yours. We could just stop and think about that for a long time. What does that mean? Let's lavishly celebrate our love. His church, his people, his heart, prodigals, all of us. Let the celebration of our belonging begin. Thanks be to God.